Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. The summer of 1977 was supposed to be a time of new beginnings for me. I had recently given birth to my first child, a beautiful baby girl who quickly became the center of my world. Motherhood had taken over my life, and I decided to take a break from my job to stay home and care for her. But as most new mothers quickly realize, financial responsibilities don't pause for parental leave. My husband was working long hours and the bills were piling up. So when my mother, who owned a small antique shop in town, offered me and my younger sister Layla a temporary job, I saw it as a lifeline. Mom's shop, Abbott's Antiques, was nestled in the heart of our sleepy little town, surrounded by old brick buildings and cobblestone streets that echoed with history. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the scent of aged wood, dust, and polish mingled with the soft glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The shop was filled with treasures from another era: intricately carved tables, vintage clocks that ticked with a hypnotic rhythm, and wardrobes that seemed to hold secrets within their polished wood. It was a world away from the chaos of diapers, bottles, and sleepless nights, and for a few hours each day, I could lose myself in the work. Layla, who had just turned 17, was eager to help out as well. She was the picture of youthful energy and beauty, with her long blonde hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled with a carefree spirit. Layla was the kind of girl who drew attention wherever she went, always surrounded by friends and admirers. I, on the other hand, was more reserved, my thoughts consumed by the new responsibilities of motherhood. The stark contrast between us had always been there. Layla was the social butterfly league, and I was the quiet, practical one. But despite our differences, we were close, bonded by sisterhood and the shared experience of growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. That summer, Abbott's Antiques had received a shipment of European furniture, a collection of oak pieces that had seen better days but still held a certain charm. Our job was to clean, polish, and restore the furniture, making it ready for sale. It was tedious work, scrubbing away years of grime, tightening screws, and buffing the wood until it gleamed. But Layla and I enjoyed working together, laughing and chatting as we went about our tasks. The shop was quiet most days, with only the occasional customer wandering in to browse. It was on one of those quiet, sweltering afternoons that everything changed. The bell above the shop door chimed softly, signaling the arrival of a customer. Layla and I looked up from the armoire we were polishing as a man walked in. He was tall and lean, with dark, wavy hair that framed a handsome face. His clothes were neat, though casual, and he carried himself with an air of confidence that immediately caught our attention. He introduced himself as Theo Sanders, his voice smooth and pleasant, with a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. There was something about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Theo began wandering through the shop, his eyes scanning the various pieces of furniture with interest. He seemed genuinely captivated by the collection, commenting on the craftsmanship and the history of some of the items. But it wasn't long before his attention shifted from the furniture to Layla. He struck up a conversation with her, complimenting her on her work and asking about the town. Layla, always friendly and polite, responded with her usual charm, though I noticed a slight edge to her smile. It was subtle, but there, a flicker of discomfort that mirrored my own unease. As they talked, I couldn't help but watch Theo closely. There was something off about him, something in the way he looked at Layla that made my skin crawl. His smile seemed too perfect, too practiced, as if it were a mask hiding something darker underneath. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just another customer. But the longer he stayed, the more my unease grew. Eventually, Theo stopped in front of an oak armoire, running his hand over the polished surface with an appreciative nod. "This is a beautiful piece," he remarked, turning to face us. "I think I'd like to buy it." Layla and I exchanged a glance. The armoire was one of the more expensive items in the shop, and a sale would be a welcome boost to our finances. But there was a catch. Theo explained that he was driving a Volkswagen Bug, and there was no way he could transport the armoire in such a small car. He said he'd have to return with a truck, which was currently at a nearby auto shop for repairs. Then, almost casually, he suggested that we go out to dinner with him that evening. The offer was so sudden, so out of the blue, that it caught both of us off guard. Layla and I exchanged another glance, this one filled with mutual confusion. We had just met this man, and now he was asking us out? It didn't make sense, and the way he asked felt almost calculated, like he had expected us to say yes. But we didn't. I had a baby at home who needed me, and Layla had a boyfriend who she was very much in love with. We both declined politely, thanking him for the offer, but explaining that we had other plans. I expected him to take the hint, to accept our refusal, and move on. But Theo wasn't the type to give up easily. His expression didn't falter as he tried again, this time directing his attention to me. "Maybe you could ride with me to get the truck?" he suggested. "I'll drop the bug off at the shop and we can pick up the truck together. It won't take long." The request sent a chill down my spine. There was no reason for me to go with him. He could easily handle it on his own. And yet, there was an insistence in his tone that made it clear he wanted one of us to go with him. I hesitated, my mind racing as I searched for an excuse, any reason to refuse without making the situation awkward. Finally, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "I'm sorry, but I need to get home to my baby. I'm still nursing and I can't be away for too long." For a moment, Theo's smile wavered, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice. He quickly recovered, his expression smooth and pleasant once more. "Of course," he said, nodding as if he understood. "Maybe some other time then." But I could tell he wasn't satisfied with my answer. He lingered in the shop, making small talk with Layla while I finished polishing the armoire. I could feel his eyes on me every so often, watching, calculating. It was unnerving, and I found myself glancing at the clock more frequently, willing the minutes to pass faster. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Theo suggested another time to pick up the armoire, 10 p.m. that night. I could barely hide my shock. The shop closed at 6, and there was no reason for us to be there that late. Layla and I both shook our heads, explaining that we wouldn't be available. But Theo didn't stop there. He asked about early morning, perhaps 5:30 a.m., or maybe another late evening. His persistence was growing more unsettling by the minute, and I could see the unease in Layla's eyes matching my own. "We close at 6, I repeated firmly, hoping to put an end to the conversation. "And we don't open until 9 the next morning." Theo smiled, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Frustration, maybe, or something darker. "Well, I'm not sure I can make that work," he said slowly. "I might have to find another place that's a bit more flexible." Layla and I exchanged another glance, this one filled with silent agreement. As much as we needed the sale, it wasn't worth the growing sense of dread that had settled over us. We both nodded politely, offering apologies and wishing him luck in finding what he needed. Finally, after 2 long hours, Theo left the shop, promising to return once he sorted out his transportation. As soon as he was out the door, Layla and I let out a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had been building during his visit slowly began to dissipate, but the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to be shaken off. We spent the rest of the afternoon finishing our work in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. At 6 o'clock sharp, we closed up the shop, locking the door and turning off the lights. But as we stepped outside, we noticed Theo's VW Bug parked just down the street. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his gaze fixed on us as we emerged from the shop. My heart skipped a beat as he rolled down the window, calling out to us with that same easy smile. "Are you sure you don't want to grab a coffee?" he asked, his tone light but insistent. "It'll be my treat." Layla and I exchanged another glance, and this time I could see the fear in her eyes mirroring my own. "Thanks, Theo," I replied, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "But we really have to get home." For a moment, he just stared at us, his smile frozen in place. Then, without another word, he rolled up the window and started the engine. The Bug roared to life, but instead of driving away, he just sat there, watching us as we walked to our car. I could feel his eyes on us the entire time, a piercing gaze that seemed to burrow into the back of my skull. We didn't wait around to see if he would follow us. Layla and I practically ran to our car, fumbling with the keys in our rush to get inside. As soon as we were seated, I locked the doors and started the engine. We drove away quickly, glancing back only once to see Theo's car still parked in the same spot, his silhouette barely visible in the dimming evening light. The experience still rattles me, and it's only grown more intense with time. What began as a routine workday has haunted me ever since, and I can't shake it from my mind. My name is Marcus Holloway, and I'm a consultant who investigates property insurance claims. My job is to examine cases where insurance companies struggle to determine what really happened during incidents, especially in cases involving old and complicated properties. It's not uncommon for me to visit eerie, aging buildings, but nothing had prepared me for what I encountered in that basement. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I've had to continue my inspections as an essential worker. I wear disposable masks as a precaution and kindly ask homeowners to do the same for our mutual safety. On a chilly afternoon in early October, I was assigned to inspect a claim in an 1860s Victorian manor located in a remote part of New Hampshire. The house was nestled deep in the woods near a lake, a towering structure with crumbling brick walls and ornate windows that once showcased its grandeur. The property had long since been converted into a bed and breakfast, but it was now abandoned, left to decay after its owners faced tragedy. Rumors swirled that the house had a dark history tied to the Underground Railroad, with whispers of secret tunnels and trapped souls. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, I couldn't help but feel a chill, both from the icy wind and the looming presence of the house itself. My client, an older woman named Evelyn, greeted me at the door. She was quiet, almost distant, and kept her responses clipped. Her eyes seemed burdened by some unspoken sorrow, but I focused on the task at hand. The inspection required me to explore the basement, a labyrinthine nightmare of corridors and chambers that twisted into darkness. The air down there was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. I could barely see my breath in the chilly atmosphere, which only added to the unease gnawing at me. Evelyn mentioned the basement hadn't been touched in years. It was a place no one dared visit unless absolutely necessary. With my digital camera ready, I ventured into the bowels of the house. The basement was unlike anything I'd seen before. Brick vaults arched overhead like ancient catacombs, and narrow crawl spaces branched off in every direction. Some areas were wide enough to stand in, while others forced me to crouch low. In the dim light, shadows danced along the walls, creating a shifting illusion of figures moving just beyond my sight. But I brushed it off, attributing it to my nerves. As I reached one of the innermost chambers, I had to squeeze through a low archway that reminded me of an ancient bread oven. The space opened up slightly, allowing me to stand, though the ceiling still felt as though it was pressing down on me. I began snapping photos for my report, using my camera's rear screen to review each shot. After every click, the screen would briefly go blank before displaying the captured image. It was in that brief moment of darkness that I first saw her. As the screen flickered, a face appeared behind me, a woman's face, gaunt and hollow-eyed. She was close enough that I instinctively recoiled, convinced the homeowner had crept up behind me. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence. Confused, I took a deep breath and peeked back out of the chamber. Evelyn stood in another part of the basement, far from where I was. She was adjusting her mask absent-mindedly, unaware of my rising panic. Swallowing my fear, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe some weird reflection or shadow. But as I resumed the inspection, a gnawing feeling told me otherwise. I lifted the camera again and, with a trembling hand, took another shot. This time I paid closer attention to the screen's momentary blankness. There she was again, standing behind me. Only now I saw her more clearly. She wore a worn, frayed bonnet that clung tightly to her head, the fabric so thin it almost seemed translucent. Her face was pale, her expression severe, and her eyes, those eyes bore into mine, brimming with a sorrow that seemed centuries old. She was much older than Evelyn, perhaps in her late 40s or early 50s, with lines of anguish etched deep into her features. My stomach twisted as I realized her gaze wasn't fixed on me, but on something, or someone, far beyond this world. I spun around, desperately searching for any sign of her, but I was alone. The figure had vanished as quickly as she'd appeared. Still, I wasn't imagining it. I could sense her presence lingering, heavy and malevolent, just out of reach. The chamber had grown colder, the shadows lengthening as if they were closing in around me. I needed to finish up and get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching. I decided to casually ask Evelyn if she'd ever experienced anything strange in the house. "Has anyone ever mentioned odd occurrences here?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She barely flinched, her face emotionless as she simply shook her head. "Not that I've heard," she replied, but something in her tone told me she knew more than she let on. After completing the inspection, I hurried back up the stairs, trying to leave the basement and that unsettling presence behind. But as I made my way out, I glanced at the camera screen one last time. Though there were no more reflections, a single image of the woman's face was burned into my mind, a ghostly echo that would haunt my nightmares. The ride home was silent and somber, my thoughts racing. Was this woman a spirit trapped in the house, tied to its dark past? Or was she something more sinister? I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. The face in that camera screen was not just a trick of the light. It was something real, something otherworldly. And I'll never forget the way it made me feel. Like I'd brushed against a shadow from another time, a soul that was still searching for peace in that decaying mansion. Who knows what really lurks in those forgotten basements, lost in the crevices of history? Whatever it was, I saw something I'll never be able to explain, and I'm not sure I ever want to return to a place like that again. It was July 2nd, 2007, when I first set foot on Isla Verde, a remote tropical island nestled in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. As a newly assigned officer, I had heard stories about this place, a paradise shrouded in both beauty and mystery. The locals spoke in reverent tones about the island's ancient history, warning newcomers about the Datu Puno, the ancestral spirits said to guard the land. These spirits, according to legends, still watch over their sacred sites, dense forests, hidden valleys, and old villages that have stood undisturbed for centuries. The locals were adamant that if you enter these sacred places, you must ask for permission, even if you don't speak the island's native language. They believe the Datu Puno understand the intent behind your words, but they warned me not to take the spirits lightly. Disrespect could result in scratches, pinches, or even worse. I shrugged it off at first, but deep down, something about their sincerity gave me pause. A few weeks later, I decided to take a riverboat tour with my family. It was the perfect opportunity to explore Isla Verde's wild interior, winding through rivers surrounded by thick jungle. The day started off bright, with a layer of morning mist gradually giving way to the fierce tropical sun. We set out around 1 p.m., and the boat's gentle hum was almost hypnotic as we glided down the emerald green waters. Our guide, an elderly man with deep lines etched into his weathered face, pointed out local wildlife along the banks, darting fish, croaking frogs, and even the elusive island deer and wild boar that roamed freely. The boat ventured deeper into the island, taking us far from the familiar coastline into an area few tourists visit. After about an hour, the guide announced that we would be stopping to visit a reconstructed native village, a painstaking recreation of life as it was 1,000 years ago. He warned us before docking that we must ask for permission from the spirits before setting foot in the forest. He wasn't joking. His voice carried an edge of seriousness that silenced the group. I saw a few nervous chuckles among the tourists, but I wasn't laughing. I took the warning to heart. As the boat bumped against the dock and we disembarked, I whispered a request for permission, not just once, but twice. Even before we began the short hike to the village, I felt the air change. The island's oppressive humidity pressed down on us, but there was something more, a heaviness that clung to the forest itself. The path was narrow, winding its way between towering trees whose tangled roots seemed to grasp at the earth like gnarled hands. Dense vegetation formed a natural tunnel above us, blocking out much of the sunlight, making the day feel more like dusk. The shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally, creating pockets of darkness that felt almost alive. As we moved deeper into the forest, that feeling of being watched became more intense. It was as if unseen eyes were tracking our every move, hovering just out of sight. I glanced back repeatedly, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone or something lurking in the underbrush. But there was nothing visible, just the rustling leaves and the creaking of old wood. Despite this, I couldn't shake the sensation that whatever was watching us was angry, displeased by our intrusion. My heart pounded harder with every step, and I noticed that my family had grown unusually quiet. My wife, typically skeptical of anything supernatural, had a furrowed brow, gripping our daughter's hand tightly. When we finally reached the village, I was relieved to step out of the oppressive shadows. The recreated village was a fascinating glimpse into the past, with thatched huts, fire pits, and ancient stone carvings that seemed to whisper tales of long-lost rituals. The guide spoke with reverence about the history and culture of the island's first inhabitants, painting a vivid picture of life before colonization. But even as I tried to focus on his words, my attention kept drifting back to the dark forest that loomed behind us. I could almost feel a presence there, watching from the trees, waiting for us to leave. After the presentation, we were led along a different path back to the dock. This trail was narrower and seemed even more claustrophobic than the first, the trees pressing in on all sides. The air grew thick with tension, each step heavier than the last. The shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, almost as if they were reaching out toward us. I kept whispering words of respect, hoping to pacify whatever might be following us. My wife's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence replaced by an undeniable unease. She admitted in a shaky voice that she felt like someone was right behind her, but whenever she turned around, no one was there. The path took us past a series of ancient stone markers covered in moss. The guide hurried us along, muttering something about not lingering near those stones for too long. I tried to ignore the sudden drop in temperature that seemed to cling to that area, but it was impossible not to feel it, a chill that cut straight through the tropical heat. The sounds of the jungle, normally vibrant and alive, fell eerily silent as we passed, replaced only by the crunching of our footsteps on the dry leaves. It felt as though time itself had slowed, each moment stretched taut with dread. Finally, we reached the dock, and I breathed a sigh of relief as we boarded the boat. The tension lifted almost immediately as the boat pulled away, leaving the dark forest behind. But even as the dense greenery receded into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out. The air still buzzed with a strange energy, a lingering presence that I couldn't quite place. Back at our starting point, everyone seemed eager to share their experiences. Despite the humid heat, several people, including my wife, claimed they had felt cold spots in the forest, like icy fingers brushing against their skin. Some reported hearing faint whispers in a language they didn't understand, while others claimed they saw fleeting shadows darting between the trees. Even the most skeptical among us admitted that something was off, something that couldn't be easily explained away. My wife, who had always dismissed ghost stories and local legends, became a believer after that day. She swore she felt something brushing past her as we walked, an invisible force that sent chills down her spine. The others were equally convinced that we had crossed into a place where the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. As for me, I left Isla Verde with a newfound respect for the island's mysteries. I had always considered myself rational and level-headed, but that walk through the sacred valley changed something in me. I couldn't deny that we had stepped into a place where ancient spirits still held sway, watching over their lands with a fierce and unforgiving gaze. The island's beauty was undeniable, but it was clear that beneath its paradise veneer lay a power that demanded respect, a power that could make even the most hardened skeptic believe in the unseen. To this day, I can still feel the weight of those eyes on me whenever I think back to that walk. The shadows, the chill, and the sensation of being watched have never fully left me. I'm convinced that whatever spirits dwell in Isla Verde's forests are still there, guarding their secrets and waiting for those foolish enough to trespass without permission. This is the story of an entity I've come to think of as Thatcher. The first time I encountered him, he was clad in a tweed jacket that stood out against the darkness, and it's a moment that changed me forever. Sometimes hauntings come from a location, sometimes from an object, and sometimes from a person. In this case, I believe Thatcher is tied to a location, an ominous one that lingers in my memories. Back in the mid 1980s, when I was just a child of 4 or 5 years old, my family lived in an old house on Preston Avenue in the quiet neighborhood of Winslow Park, located on the outskirts of a bustling city. Winslow Park was one of those towns with a mix of history and forgotten whispers. The street was lined with homes that ranged from early 1920s bungalows to more modern brick homes built in the 60s, much like the place we lived in, a modest 1930s style house. Preston Avenue itself was just a stone's throw away from one of the town's main roads, Hillcrest Drive, which had once been a quiet lane but had since become a central artery connecting Winslow Park to the city. Winslow Park was one of those forgotten neighborhoods, overshadowed by the city nearby. While researching it years later, I learned that it was initially founded by settlers who mimicked the colonial architecture of their European origins, and as in many parts of the country, these settlers claimed the land from the original indigenous inhabitants, erasing nearly all traces of the land's true history. But despite its dark undercurrents, the town had its charms, a mix of history, nature, and curious energy that drew in artists and dreamers alike. Our backyard was bordered by an old pasture that was home to a few horses. As a kid, I used to feed one of them through the back fence, captivated by the gentle creature. A short walk down the road led to a vine-covered laneway that seemed like it had leapt out of a fairy tale. Dense, dark, and lush, the laneway twisted its way past the remnants of an old vineyard, now overgrown with tangled greenery. That's where the eerie atmosphere of Winslow Park was most palpable. This incident I'm about to describe happened around the same time as the strange occurrences that seemed to plague that house. To this day, I'm not sure whether this memory predates or follows the other bizarre experiences. My bedroom was simple. A small bed tucked under a window with curtains that were sheer enough for streetlight to filter through. It wasn't pitch dark in my room at night. The light from a nearby street lamp cast long shadows that played across the walls. The window was on the side of the house, overlooking a narrow strip of garden where an unruly tea tree grew, its branches scratching the side fence. One night, I woke up to find a strange man perched in that tree, just outside my window. He wasn't doing anything sinister, merely sitting in the branches as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I wasn't scared, just curious. The tree was too spindly for someone to climb, yet there he was, comfortably settled among the branches. I peered at him through the edge of the curtain. He was no more than 2 feet away from me. Despite how close he was, there was a peacefulness about the encounter. His skin was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, but it was his nose that really grabbed my attention, a long, curved nose that looked like it belonged on a bird, almost like a toucan's beak. His lips were thin and wide, stretched into a faint smile. He wore a tweed jacket, old and weathered, that clashed with his unnaturally lanky frame. I can't recall much about his eyes, but I remember his hair, wild as if it hadn't been combed in years. You could say it was just a dream, but it felt too real, too vivid to dismiss. As a child, I often wandered around the house at night, an odd little habit of mine. But that night, I stayed in bed, transfixed by the sight of this strange man. We locked eyes, or at least I think we did, for what felt like hours, and then I drifted back to sleep, lulled by the odd calmness of it all. Looking back, I realized that this experience marked the beginning of an obsession I developed, an obsession with tweed fabric. Before that night, my fashion sense as a toddler was entirely centered around bright colors, glitter, and sequins. But suddenly, tweed fascinated me. I would stare at my mom's old tweed jacket or my granddad's hat, wondering how the patterns came together, what the fabric's history was, and why I felt so drawn to it. The second time I saw Thatcher was at another house in Winslow Park. My parents were going through one of their many separations, and during that time, my mom and I moved into a small flat above a bakery. The building was a narrow 3-story structure, the top floor overlooking a quiet intersection where the town's main roads crossed paths. One evening, I heard a commotion on the street below. Curious, I went to the window to see what was happening. A couple of men were arguing, likely drunk. But there, just beyond the fence in the shadow of the alley, was a faintly glowing figure. It was Thatcher. this time tinted with a dull pink hue, like a neon light dimmed by dust. He was standing there, watching the brawl with that same peculiar calm. I told my mom about the figure behind the fence, but she misunderstood, thinking I was talking about someone suspicious, and called the police. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain that it wasn't a real person, at least not in the conventional sense, but I don't think they believed a word of it. I still remember the bemused expression on the older officer's face as he patted me on the head and told me to stop worrying about ghosts. The third time was at my grandmother's house in Hollow Glen. My parents had split for good by then, and we moved in with her for a while. My grandmother was a musician, a pianist who kept a grand piano in her living room. It was during the Christmas season, and her small tinsel-covered tree sparkled in the corner. One night, in a fit of childish rebellion, I decided to sneak out of bed and play the piano in the dark, thinking it would be a delightfully gothic thing to do. As I tiptoed toward the piano, I noticed something moving outside the window. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from the tree ornaments, but then I realized it was the same pink figure from before, now shifting across the yard. I froze as Thatcher's outline came into focus. A spectral silhouette, moving with an almost leisurely pace between our yard and the neighbors. This time, he looked directly at me, and for the first time I felt fear. I dashed back to bed without ever playing a single note. The years passed, and the memory of Thatcher faded into the background. By the time I was a teenager, my curiosity had evolved into a full-blown obsession with the paranormal. I delved into all sorts of occult practices, including dabbling with Ouija boards, a decision that led to some unnerving experiences involving an entity that called itself Charlie. This spirit harassed me for months, leaving me drained and paranoid. I'll save those details for another time, but it was one of the darkest periods of my life. Once that nightmare ended, I thought I was done with strange entities. But then, Thatcher returned. I was in bed one night, having just turned out the lights, when I heard a faint thud by my door. I looked up to see a shadowy figure standing there. The same tweed coat, the same elongated nose, and wild hair. Despite the shadowy form, I could make out the details I had seen years ago. He didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, a gesture almost like a polite nod, he faded away. It was strangely comforting, reminding me of the peaceful feeling I had as a child when I first saw him. The last encounter was different because it wasn't in the waking world. It happened in a dream, a vivid, almost lucid dream that left a lasting impression. In the dream, I was working in an old haberdashery store, one that had been closed for decades. The lighting was warm, and I was behind the counter when Thatcher walked in. This time, he looked almost human. No tweed coat, just a simple black jacket. He handed me his coat and said something in a language I didn't recognize, but I somehow understood the message. You are seen. The scene shifted, and we were in a grand, decaying mansion filled with dusty furniture and hidden rooms. I found myself drawn to a piano in the corner of a dimly lit room, but before I could touch the keys, Thatcher appeared beside me, warning me not to play. We need to leave, he said, again in that strange language. The dream shifted once more. We were now standing on a dark road outside the mansion. There was a crowd, a wild, raucous party, but they didn't seem to notice us. In the distance, I saw a blinding light approaching, growing brighter with each passing moment. I understood that the light was something catastrophic, and we needed to get out before it arrived. Thatcher led me through the chaos toward a forest at the edge of the road, and as we entered the trees, I woke up. For days after that dream, I felt as if Thatcher was nearby, watching, waiting. I haven't seen him in years, but I sometimes feel like he's still out there, lingering in the shadows of forgotten places, keeping his distance, but never fully gone. Sometimes I wonder if he's tied to the history of Winslow Park, or if he's something older, something that's simply chosen to follow me. I've researched similar accounts online and in local legends, but I've never found a match. Whether he's a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely, I don't know. But one thing I do know is this: no matter where I go, I'll always feel a faint connection to Thatcher. a presence just out of reach, like a familiar figure lurking in the twilight between sleep and waking. He's out there in the shadows, waiting, and in some strange way, I find that oddly reassuring. I heard someone calling my name in the forest. It was late October when the town council decided to carve a new road through the forest behind our neighborhood. The construction was controversial. Some said it was to open the area for more homes, while others claimed it was a convenient shortcut between the main highway and the new commercial district. Whatever the reason, it transformed the once isolated woodland into a semi-public thoroughfare, with curious locals exploring the new path. But for those of us who had known the forest in its untamed state, it felt like an intrusion, a disruption of something ancient and undisturbed. I had always loved walking my dogs through the older, denser parts of the forest, where the canopy was thick enough to block out most of the sunlight, even on bright days. There was a serenity in those shaded trails, a kind of silence that you could almost hear. But when the new road was completed, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore it, despite the lingering feeling that I was stepping into something I shouldn't. The first few walks were uneventful. The road was smooth, wide, and flanked by neatly trimmed bushes that felt completely out of place in the rugged forest. It seemed like the life of the woods had been pushed back, held at bay by this new artificial scar cutting through the heart of it. I didn't feel righter, but I kept going, telling myself that it was just my attachment to the old trails. But one afternoon, I decided to take the road all the way to its end. It was a gray, overcast day with a damp chill in the air. The road stretched deeper into the forest than I had realized, winding through sections I'd never ventured into before. My dogs seemed tense, ears pricked, and their usual enthusiasm was dulled. They stayed close by me, eyes darting from side to side as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. Finally, I reached the end. A dead end, really. The road just stopped at a wide clearing with a steep drop ahead, like a cliff that descended into dense, dark forest below. There were no barriers, no warning signs, just the abrupt end of human encroachment. Beyond that point was pure wilderness, untouched and wild. The silence there was heavier, more oppressive. The air felt thicker, like it was holding its breath. I found a spot on the ground and decided to sit for a while, letting my dogs drink from the water bottle I'd brought. The world was hushed, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I could see the edge of the cliff from where I sat. It was a sheer drop with jagged rocks and twisted roots poking out like skeletal fingers. I shuddered to think how easily someone could slip and disappear into the darkness below. As I sat there lost in thought, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone calling my name. It was faint at first, almost like an echo carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen. My dogs, usually alert to every sound, didn't seem to notice it. They continued lapping up water, completely unaware. Then it came again, clearer this time, a voice calling my name. I couldn't tell if it was male or female. It was as if the sound was twisted, distorted, barely recognizable as human. But I was sure of one thing. It was my name being called. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was someone from the neighborhood messing with me. But how would they know I was here, so deep into the forest? And who could it be? The voice wasn't familiar. There was no warmth or recognition in it. It was just a voice, disembodied and persistent. I stood up and called back, expecting a response, but there was nothing. Just the voice repeating my name over and over, coming from the direction of the cliff. The sound carried through the air, rising and falling like a chant. It was both distant and close at the same time, as if the forest itself was amplifying it. My dogs suddenly went rigid, hackles raised, staring at the direction of the cliff. I could feel the tension radiating off them as they began to whine softly, tails tucked between their legs. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was someone down below, a hiker or someone who had gotten lost. But the cliff was steep, almost vertical. There was no way anyone could be standing there, let alone calling out from below. The voice didn't stop. It kept repeating my name, the intonation changing slightly each time, like it was experimenting, trying out different ways to say it. It was unnerving, like someone testing the limits of their vocal cords. There was a cold, detached quality to it, as if it wasn't a person, but an imitation of one, mimicking human speech. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just from the direction of the cliff, but from all around. The shadows under the trees seemed darker, thicker, like they were stretching out toward me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, moving between the trunks. But there was nothing except that voice, calling my name again and again. When I finally turned and headed back down the road, the voice didn't fade. It followed me, echoing through the trees as if whatever was calling me was moving along with me, unseen but ever present. The dogs were nearly dragging me at this point, desperate to get away. I quickened my pace, the sound growing more distant but never fully disappearing until I was back at the edge of town. Only then did the voice stop. For days afterward, the memory of that voice haunted me. I avoided the new road entirely, sticking to the older, safer trails. But the unease never left. The forest felt different now, tainted somehow. Even when I walked through familiar parts, I felt eyes on me, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the sensation that something out there had noticed me, singled me out. It was as if the forest had awakened to my presence and didn't want me to leave. Against my better judgment, I went back one more time, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. It was late afternoon, with the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the road. I walked cautiously, ears straining for any hint of that voice. But the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes every small sound seem magnified. Even the birds and insects seemed to have retreated. When I reached the dead end again, I stopped, staring at the cliff. The air felt colder here, almost like stepping into another world. I listened, half expecting to hear my name again, but all I could hear was the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches swaying in the wind. I almost started to relax, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the mind. But then I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, like the air itself had thickened. The shadows around the cliff deepened, pooling together until they seemed to form shapes, figures moving at the edge of my vision. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, I heard it again, my name. It was softer this time, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. I didn't wait to hear it again. I turned and ran, my dogs sprinting alongside me. I didn't stop until I was back home, breathless and shaken. I haven't gone back since. I still think about that voice, about what could have been calling me from the bottom of that cliff. Was it just a trick of the mind, or was there something truly there, lurking in the shadows? And why did it know my name? Sometimes I catch myself staring out at the edge of the forest from my window, half expecting to see something moving among the trees. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it faintly. My name, carried on the wind, echoing from the depths of the forest. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for me to return. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.